Well, my understanding, and it's still very early, and I heard it in the news like everyone else. Um, it seems that at this point, it is just a cessation of hostilities. There's no agreement on anything. And the Iranians have said that if the Israelis carry out strikes on Iran, we will renew the conflict and we will start firing missiles at the regime. Now, apparently, a missile struck Israel, the regime, after the ceasefire, and they dropped something on a field of, I don't know, grass or somewhere uh, symbolic. They didn't do anything in particular. I don't know if there will be an Iranian response or not because they didn't do anything. But the fact is that uh, the Israeli regime carried out an act of war. They initiated war. It was a blitzkrieg. They murdered people as they were with friends and family. It was the night of Eid and celebration, and they destroyed some of the Iranian air defense systems and radars during the first few hours. And so, since a lot of the senior commanders, six, seven senior commanders, I don't remember the exact number, they were martyred. It took time for the Iranians to regroup. But after a few hours, Iran began to fire its missiles, and then it began to regroup and begin the fight. And progressively, things got worse for the regime. And that's why Netanyahu was basically begging for Trump to get involved, and Trump carried out his own act of war. Again, we have to remember that all of this was happening as Iran was negotiating. But Trump was lying. He was dishonest. He was deceitful. He was plotting against Iran as he was negotiating. And it now turns out that it's not just that he was plotting since almost possibly the beginning of the negotiations, but apparently this attack has been planned uh, from previous administrations for over a decade now. But I'm sure we'll get more information about that in the future. So after the U.S. strike, which is a different issue, we can cover. Netanyahu continued to he began to beg for a ceasefire, and the Iranians continued it until this morning. And while Iran has been hurt, there's no doubt about that. After all, again, it was a sudden attack. It was a blitzkrieg attack like Nazi Germany. And some of Iran's important radar assets and uh, air defense assets were damaged and destroyed during those first hours. But Iran regrouped. It hit hard. It wasn't Iran that asked for a ceasefire. It was the Israeli regime. And Iran continued. And ultimately, during the last 2, 3 hours before the ceasefire or the cessation of hostilities took effect, the Iranians were hammering different parts of the Israeli regime from north to south to send a message that we can continue with this. I would say that this is a win for Iran. Now, it wasn't a decisive defeat for the regime where it comes to the edge of collapse or anything like that. But it was a win for Iran, and the biggest loser of all, I think, is Netanyahu personally, because he uh, he showed that the Israeli regime is not invincible. This is the first time that the regime is being hit day and night, every single day, by missiles, heavy missiles. Iranian missiles are much more devastating than Israeli missiles. Israeli missiles have small warheads, they're fired from aircraft. The Iranian missiles have huge payloads. So every time an Iranian missile strikes, it causes enormous damage. And of course, the cost of the Israeli air defense system, as your viewers know, is enormous itself. So every time Iran fires a drone, and Iran has been firing hundreds, I think probably maybe 1,000 drones. I don't know. We'll have to see the numbers. They'll probably come out ultimately. And many of them have been hitting their targets, but they've not been the focus because the missiles have such more they have much bigger impact. So the Israelis have been spending huge amounts of money to block drones and missiles. So even if they hit the drone, they're paying 15, 20 times as much as the Iranians have. In fact, many of these drones, not all, I don't know the percentage, but many of these drones and many of these missiles are very old. And so they were in stock, and the Iranians have been getting rid of them. Again, I'm not saying that the Iranians weren't hurt. The Israelis killed lots of people. They killed lots of women and children. Last night, they bombed the hospital not far from here. I think I would say it's an hour's walk, an hour's distance walk. And they, outside of Tehran, they bombed a building in a city in the north, and they they wiped out two families in that apartment building, in that building, and they've been hitting different areas. It's been largely targeting civilians, especially during the previous night. But throughout, no, throughout, it's mostly been civilians. In some cases, they struck uh, guard buildings that belong to the armed forces, but most of them were already empty. Uh, from day one, everything has been emptied. I remember when I was at Press TV during the interviews during the first couple of days, they had evacuated everyone from the building. But as I was doing the interviews, there was always a couple of people in the building taking out all of the sensitive electronic equipment that's expensive. So that's what was happening across Tehran and elsewhere, and especially in key and sensitive sites. So most of the casualties as a result were civilian, and a lot of the government buildings or military buildings that were hit were largely empty. They murdered a senior government official who worked for the Ministry of Energy. She was the head of statistics for Iran's electrical power plants. They struck their building, again, a civilian, and murdered her. But that's just how the Israeli regime works. They don't care about people. They have no red lines. They don't consider non-Zionists to be human. We are all considered to be subhuman. And of course, the West is the same. Western elites consider us to be subhuman. That's why they support the Israelis throughout the genocide in Gaza, the Holocaust there, the genocidal strikes in Lebanon, and of course, the attacks on Iran. One advantage that this war had, although Iran's uh, nuclear infrastructure was damaged, no doubt about it. But first of all, Iran has many scientists. Um, Natanz is can easily be built. It's not that difficult. Fordow was never a priority for Iran. Natanz was never a priority because Fordow was well protected. We have to see how badly Fordow was damaged. But it is clear that Iran took out its key assets from all of these installations before they were struck. And in the case when the Americans struck, I think, and I don't know, I really don't know, I don't have inside information, but it seems that the Americans told the Iranians beforehand, and the Iranians emptied many things, just like the Iranians warned beforehand when they struck Qatar and the American CENTCOM center there.
You mentioned the objectives of Israeli attack. You said that Iran won because of those objectives. One of the objectives was, I think the main objective was to do so-called regime change in Iran. And how did that work for the Netanyahu administration, for Israelis who were somehow hoping by these people outside Iran, Iranian people who are participating, collaborating with them?
Well, yes, of course. The issue has never been the nuclear program. And I've said this many times before. It's never been human rights. It's never been animal rights. It's never been global warming. It's never been terrorism and all the things that they use to sanction Iran and to harm Iran. That's not been the point. For 40 some years, the issue has been regime change. It has been undermining Iran and the Islamic Republic of Iran, because Iran is fiercely independent, unlike other countries across the region. But in this case, just as important, Iran is the supporter of the Palestinian cause. And that is what makes the West so outraged and angry and intolerant of Iran. So that has always been the objective. And the Israeli regime miscalculated. We discussed this earlier. Iranian society has always viewed the Islamic Republic as legitimate, the legitimate state in Iran, whether the West likes it or not. People may be dissatisfied. Of course they are. They're always dissatisfied. Iranians in general, as you know, are people who, they are, we are usually dissatisfied. If we sit together among friends, we never say anything positive about a government, any government, or about the metro or airlines or anything or prices. That's just how we are. And of course, under sanctions, the maximum pressure sanctions that we've had for years, a part of Iran's sacrifice for being independent and supporting Palestine, it's been more difficult. But as I said, the legitimacy of the state in Iran is high. But what the Israelis actually did and what the Americans did is that they strengthened the state because that segment of Iranian society that would consider itself to be Western oriented, or maybe they don't consider themselves to be Western oriented, but I would say they're Western oriented, especially among the middle class parts, large parts of the middle class, not all of them, large parts of them, and the upper middle class, not all of them, but again, a large segment of them. Their worldview has been devastated because they've seen the United States show deceit, and they've seen that Iran was negotiating, and then the Americans betrayed Iran and were deceitful and dishonest. And that wasn't just Trump. When he initiated the conflict against Iran or supported it, we saw the liberal media in the West support him. CNN and Fox News played the same role. Breitbart and the New York Times played the same role. One may use more bombastic language, and the other may be more, more a bit more, not very, but a bit more sophisticated in its propaganda. But young Iranians, educated Iranians who thought differently for whatever reason, uh, confronted reality. So I think the West has done itself a lot, has damaged itself among this class of Iranians. Also, I would say that this has created a permanent mistrust in Iran among the government and among elites towards the West. And it will quicken Iran's move towards the global South and towards BRICS and towards Asian powers to cooperate with them. It's going to make it much, much more difficult ever to work with Western countries anytime in the future because the West supported the aggression. The Europeans supported airstrikes. And when Israel carried out an unprovoked assault, they called it an act of defense. So, you know, people in Iran, elites in Iran, see that. And also, one thing, Nima, one advantage that this has, it's war. A lot of damage was done, obviously. Although, again, Iranian missiles are much more devastating than the Israeli missiles. The Israeli missiles, their payload is much smaller. But one advantage that this has for the Iranian government as a card to play with is Iran's relationship with the International Atomic Energy Agency. In future, Iran is not going to give them that sort of access that they would have in the past, if any. And there's a debate in Iran about leaving the NPT, not producing a nuclear weapon, but just leaving so that the West would no longer know what's happening, so that the International Atomic Energy Agency would no longer pass on information to Israel to assassinate people, to bomb targets. So it's going to make, ironically, it's going to make things more difficult for the United States and the West.
You mean that Iran is concerned about the lives of its scientists? That's why they're not going to communicate the way that they did before, or it's only about the mistrust between the two parties?
Well, that the two are interrelated completely. Iran does not trust the International Atomic Energy Agency because Iran knows that they passed on information that led to the assassination of Iranian scientists. And Iran knows that it passes on information to the West and to the Israeli regime so that it can carry out attacks. And it knows that the International Atomic Energy Agency does not work with Iran in good faith, and that no matter what Iran does to prove that it's not pursuing nuclear weapons, the agency, since it's controlled by the West, and the board of directors has the majority of them, of the members, are in the Western camp, even though they are a small part of the international community. The Iranians know that working with them is next to to resolve issues. It's next to impossible. So the relationship with the IAEA is going to change. What this war did, Nima, is that it united Iranian society in an unprecedented way since Saddam Hussein invaded. The only thing that I'm just guessing, but from what I can see so far, the only segment of society that is dissatisfied now are those who said we should have continued the war. Everyone else says that Iran has every right to fight, and that Iran is in the right and the West is aggressive and they've murdered people and they're dishonest and deceitful and they don't work in good faith. That is the consensus now in Iran. Those who are unhappy say we should have continued to hammer the Israeli regime, which is a legitimate argument. I'm not saying that they have no argument to make. However, I think the calculation in Iran is that they want to keep global public opinion, not just in the region, but across the globe, and meaning including governments, on their side. Because there has been a sea change in public opinion about Palestine, about Iran, about the resistance over the past 20, 21 months. But over the past 11, 12 days, it has increased, this shift. And Russia, China, and the other BRICS nations have tilted closer to Iran. And Iran sees this as detrimental to the Israeli regime. And so since Netanyahu was the side who was begging for a ceasefire, and the Iranians did not want to expand the war because it would create a global economic catastrophe, the Iranians calculated, rightly or wrongly, that now would be the time to end the war so that there would be less suffering among ordinary Iranians, because the Israelis bomb ordinary people. Most of the people who died are ordinary people. And so that the global South will see Iran as the responsible actor, and they'll continue to view the Israeli regime as the aggressor. Now, I think the most important thing that happens here is that Netanyahu is severely weak. And I think there will be implications inside Israeli society. So he will, of course, try to spin it in a way to make it look as if he's won. But I think it's clear that Israel has shown itself no longer to be invincible. Iran, every single day, hammered the regime. And the final hours, it was Iran that was hitting the regime left and right until the end, the cessation of hostilities. So that, the Israeli regime has lost faith. The image has been destroyed along with the West because of the genocide in Gaza and the genocidal attacks on Lebanon. And in the case of Iran, it was also seen as aggressive and attacking civilian nuclear assets. The world condemned it. Forget the West. The world condemned it, but the majority. But I think that in addition to all that, the Israeli regime has been seen as militarily very vulnerable. It could bomb Iran, and part of it was because, as I said, it was a sudden attack, and they took out some of Iran's air defense and air defense radar and air defense capabilities. But it was being hit very hard. And I think that is something new for the regime, very new for the regime, unprecedented.
You mentioned the situation in Israel. I think the outcome of this conflict, this war between Iran and Israel, would bring huge repercussions within the society in Israel against Netanyahu. That would make the situation even more dangerous, because when we see the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, many people are arguing Israel may do the same with Iran. Do you, if Israel goes to the same direction as they did with Hezbollah, as they're doing right now with Hezbollah, with Lebanon, what would be the reaction from Iran?
Immediate retaliation. And Nima, have no doubt, as we speak, the military is already preparing itself. As we speak, have no doubt that within days, within hours, within days, within weeks, they're going to be working day and night to fix their radar systems, to put new radar systems in place, to complete radar systems and surface to air missile systems that they were building because Iran builds both radar and surface to air missiles. It will be seeking, I'm sure, technology and capabilities from countries that are friendly, which I'm sure because of what happened over the last 11, 12 days, it's clear. I mean, it's clear that they tilted more towards Iran. All of that, I think, is very clear. So Iran is preparing itself. And no, if the Israelis do anything, Iran will go after them. And I don't want to go into detail, and I don't know everything, but there are certain things that Iran has to uh, fix. It has to take, learn from its experience over the last couple of weeks. And I think once they've uh, dealt with their deficiencies and they've dealt with their shortcomings, next time around, it will be a lot worse for the Israeli regime. Remember, Iran's, and this is something everyone has to keep in mind, Iran's underground bases, its underground missile and drone bases are untouched. Untouched. None of them, not a single one of them has been destroyed. Now, the problem that Iran had was the Israelis were able to go and strike the entrance points of these bases, not destroy them. But then the Iranians would have to open, just like in what the Americans would do in Yemen, right? They'd strike the entry points of the bases, and then they'd have to reopen them again. So the Israelis were constantly doing that. But that is something that can be resolved. And again, this happened because of the sudden nature of the attack. But there are ways in which Iran can be able to protect itself against Israeli regime aggression in the future and be much more effective in hitting back. So the advantage lies with Iran. And what Iran is betting on, again, I'm speculating here, but what Iran is betting on is that Netanyahu was begging for this ceasefire. And it came out that he was begging for this ceasefire. It came to the public, it became public knowledge before the actual ceasefire. And when Iran hammered the regime during the last couple of hours, uh, that hurt him. And I think what Iran is betting on is for Netanyahu, for this to create deeper divisions inside Israel. And for those divisions to become critical and to push, and hopefully to push Israel towards some sort of internal crisis. But remember, Iran is not Hezbollah. Hezbollah is not the government in Lebanon. If Hezbollah was the government, it would be able to hit the Israelis back much harder. But Lebanon is a society where the Americans and the Europeans have much influence, and they have many people on the payroll. And so, while the majority of Lebanese support Hezbollah, according to the recent elections and polls, but a strong minority is clearly in the American camp, and in a segment of that minority is in the Israeli camp, the fascists and like the people in the Lebanese forces. So, and they are, based on the Constitution, they have a disproportionate amount of power in Lebanon, and of course, you have all the Western embassies and NGOs. So Hezbollah is not Iran. It has to, it's not Yemen, where Yemen controls, Ansarullah and its allies control the government. Hezbollah doesn't have that status in Lebanon. If it did, it would be able to create much greater harm to the Israelis at much less cost. sort of like in Gaza, even though Gaza is smaller, but since it's entirely controlled by the resistance, you know, stabbing it in the back, undermining it is much more difficult from the inside.